Next, I counted the flyers again. All 5 were there. I slid all of them back except for the blue one. I held it up so it could catch some of the light from the big fire. I kept looking at the picture and wondering why this one bothered Mama so much. The more I thought about it, the more I knew this man just had to be my father. Why else would Mama keep these? I used a little trick to help me fall off to sleep. I pulled my blanket right up over my head and breathed in the smell real deep. After doing this 3 times, the smells of the shack in Hooverville were gone, and only the smell of the blanket was in my nose. And that smell always reminded me of Mama and how she used to read to me to sleep every night. I took 2 more breaths and pretended I was hearing Mama reading to me about the billy goat's gruff, or the fox and the grapes, or the dog that saw his reflection in the water, or some other story she'd checked out of the library. I could hear Mama's voice getting farther and farther away as I imagined I was in the story, until finally her voice and the story all mixed into one. I learned that it was best to be asleep before Mama finished the story, because if she got done and I was still awake, she'd always tell me what the story was about. I never told Mama, but that always meant the fun of the stories. Shucks, here I was thinking I was just hearing something funny about a fox or a dog, and Mama spoiled it by telling me they were really lessons about not being greedy or not wishing for things you couldn't have. I took 2 more breaths and started thinking about the little hen that baked the bread. I heard, "Not I," said the pig. "Not I," said the goat. "Not I," said the big bad wolf. Then whoop, zoop, sloop. I was asleep. I started dreaming about the man with the giant fiddle. He was walking away and I kept calling him, but he couldn't look back. Then the dream got a lot better. I turned away from where Herman E. Calloway was, and there stood Deza Malone. I told her, "I really like your dimple." She laughed and said, "See you in 7 years." A man screamed, "Get up! They're trying to sneak it out early." I jumped straight up and banged my head on the top of the shack. I ran outside. It was still dark, and the fire was just a pile of glowing sticks. The man was screaming at the top of his lungs, "Get up! They've fired the engine and are fixing to take off." Bugs and the other boys came and stood next to me. Bugs said, "Is it a raid?" Someone said, "No, they're trying to sneak out before we get up." People started running all over Hooverville. Bugs said, "Come on, Bud, get your stuff. We got to get on that train." I folded my blanket up and put it in my suitcase and tied the twine back. I put my jackknife in my pocket and Bugs and I ran outside. I hadn't got 6 giant steps away when a boy stuck his head out the door and yelled, "Hey, Slim, is this your paper?" I looked back. "My blue flyer! I forgot to put it back in the suitcase." Bugs said, "Hurry, I'll wait. I'll catch you. Go ahead." I ran back and took my flyer from the boy. "Thanks a lot." I ran back out into the crowd that was tearing through the woods. There were 1,000,000 men and boys running in the same direction. I didn't want to fold the flyer up, so as I was running, I slid it between the twine and the suitcase. I'd put it back inside once we got on the train. No one was talking. All you could hear were the sounds of 1,000,000 feet smacking on the trail and the sound of 1,000,000 people trying to catch their breath. Finally, a hiss sound started getting louder and louder, and I knew we weren't too far away. We broke out of the woods, and there in the dark sat the train. The locomotive was hissing and spitting coal black smoke into the sky. Every once in a while, a big shower of sparks would glow up from inside the dark cloud, making it look like a gigantic black genie was trying to raise up out of the smokestack. The train went as far back as you could see. There must have been 1,000 boxcars, but everyone had stopped and was just standing there watching. No one was trying to get on. I pushed my way to the front to see if I could find Bugs, and I saw why everyone had stopped. There were 4 cop cars and 8 cops standing between the crowd and the train. The cops all had billy clubs and were spread out to protect the train. The crowd kept getting bigger and bigger. One of the cops yelled, you men know you can't get on this train. Just go on back to Shantytown and there won't be no trouble." A white man said, "This is the only train going west for the next month. You know we got families to feed and have got to be on it. You go get back in your cars and you'll be right. There won't be no trouble." The cop said, "I'm warning you, the Flint police are on the way. This here is private property and they have orders to shoot anyone who tries to get on this train." A man next to me said, "I'd rather be shot than sit around and watch my kids go hungry." The cop said, "This is America, boys. You're sounding like a bunch of commies. You know I can't let you on this train. I got kids to feed too, and I'd lose my job." Someone yelled, "Well, welcome to the club, brother." It seemed like we stood looking at the cops and them looking at us for a whole hour. Our side was getting bigger and bigger, and the other cops started looking nervous. The one who was doing all the talking saw them fidgeting and said, "Hold steady, men." One of the cops said, "Jake, there's 400 men out there and more coming. I don't like these odds. Mr. Pinkerton ain't paying me enough to do this." He threw his cop hat and his billy club on the ground. Everybody froze when the train whistle blew one long time and the engine started saying, "Shh, shh, shh." The big steel wheels creaked a couple of times, then started moving. 4 of the other cops threw their hats and billy clubs down too. The boss cop said, "You lily-livered rats." And it was like someone said, "On your mark, get set, go." The engine was saying, "Shh, shh, 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 shh." And a million boys and men broke for the train. I got pushed from behind and fell on top of my suitcase. Someone reached down and pulled me up. I squeezed my bag to my stomach and ran. The train was going faster and faster. People were jumping on and reaching back to help others. I finally got to the tracks and was running as hard as I could. I looked up into the boxcar and saw Bugs. He screamed, "Bud, throw your bag! Throw me your bag!" I used both hands to throw my suitcase at the train. Bugs caught it, and when he set it behind him, the blue flyer blew out of the twine and fluttered outside the door. But it was like a miracle. The flyer flipped over 3 times and landed right in my hand. I slowed down and put it in my pocket. Bugs reached one arm out and screamed, "Bud, don't stop, run!" I started running again, but it felt like my legs were gone. The car with Bugs in it was getting farther and farther away. Finally, I stopped. Bugs was leaning out of the door and stopped reaching back for me. He waved and disappeared into the boxcar. A second later, my suitcase came flying out of the door. I walked over to where it landed and picked it up. Man, this is one tough suitcase. You couldn't even tell what it had been through. It still looked exactly the same. I sat on the side of the tracks and tried to catch my breath. The train and my new pretend brother got farther and farther away, chugging to Chicago. Man, I'd found some family, and he was gone before we could really get to know each other. There were 6 or 7 other people who didn't make the train, so we all walked back toward Hooverville. They must have lit the big fire again. The sky in that direction was glowing orange. The cop that first threw down his billy club walked over to us and said he wasn't lying about the Flint police coming, but they're coming to bust up the shanty town. You all should get out of here. When we got close to Hooverville, we heard 4 gunshots. We all spread into the woods and sneaked up to see what had happened. I peeked from behind a tree and could see a bunch of cops standing around with pistols out. All the men and boys and women that were left in Hooverville were bunched up on one side and the cops were on the other. The fire had been lit and was burning bigger than ever, but now it was burning because the cops were tearing all of the shacks down and were throwing the wood and cardboard and hunks of cloth into the middle of it. One of the cops dragged the big clothes washing pot over to the side and stuck his pistol down in it and shot 4 more times. Phew! Instead of shooting people, they were shooting holes into all of the pots and pans. A man was yelling, "You yellow belly lowlifes! You waited till you knew most of the men was gone, you cowards!" Cops wouldn't talk or nothing. They just kept piling Flint's Hooverville into the fire. I tried to see if I could spot Deza Malone, but there were too many people. It seemed like the only good thing that came out of going to Hooverville was that I finally kissed a girl. Maybe someone was trying to tell me something, that with me missing the train and the blue flyer floating back to me, maybe Deza Malone was right. Maybe I should stay here in Flint. I walked back farther into the woods and sat down. I pulled the blue flyer out of my pocket and opened my suitcase back up. I smoothed the flyer out and took another good look at it. Maybe it came floating right back to me because this Herman E. Calloway really was my father. Wait a minute. I sat up. The names Caldwell and Calloway are a lot alike. Both of them have 8 letters, and there aren't too many names that have a C a L, and a W, all together like that. I remembered what I read in that little big book, Gangbusters. It said a good criminal chooses an alias that's kind of close to their own name, except I couldn't figure out who was a criminal here and why anybody needed an alias. I wanted to stay and look for Deza and her mother, but it was too hard to hear all the people crying and arguing. Besides, I was still on the lam. I started walking. If I hurried, I could get breakfast at the mission. Chapter 9. I got to the food line in plenty of time, but my pretend family wasn't anywhere around. I had to eat by myself without the brown sugar. After I was through, I went back to the library and sat under my tree to wait for it to open. I couldn't stop thinking about Deza Malone and her dimple. How could her father find them now? Finally, I saw people going into the library. The same librarian was there again. I said, "Good morning, ma'am." "Good morning, young man. Could I please borrow a pencil and a piece of paper and see that book about how far one city is from another again, ma'am?" She said, "Of course you may. You know, after I went home last night, I finally recognized you. Didn't you and your mother used to come in here a long time ago?" "Yes, ma'am." She said, "And if I remember correctly, you and your mother had quite different tastes in books. I remember your mother used to like mysteries and fairy tales. Isn't that so?" Man, I can't believe she remembered that. "And you're the little fellow who used to come in all the time and ask Miss Hill for books about the Civil War, aren't you?" "Yes, ma'am." She said, "I thought so." She handed me the pencil and paper and the city's book, then said, "And when you're done with the book, bring it back and I have something special for you." She had a huge smile on her face. I said, "Thank you, ma'am," but I didn't get too excited because I know the kind of things librarians think are special. I went over to a table and found Flint and Grand Rapids in the lines of the book. I looked where the two lines met and it said 120. Wow, that was going to be a good little walk. Next, I wrote down 120, then divided it by 5, then came up to 24. That meant I'd have to walk for 24 hours to reach Grand Rapids, one whole day and one whole night. I figured it would be easiest to do the night part first, so I decided to stick around the library until it got dark, then head for Grand Rapids. I wrote down all the names of all the cities I'd have to pass through to get there. Owosso, Ovid, St. John's, Iona, and Lowell, and put the paper in my pocket. When I took the cities book back, the librarian was still smiling. She said, "I'll bet you've been dying to know what your surprise is, haven't you?" I lied. "Yes, ma'am." She reached under her desk and pulled out a thick book called The Pictorial History of the War Between the States. Wow, the book was gigantic. "Thank you very much, ma'am." She said, "Enjoy, enjoy, enjoy." I took the book back to my table. I didn't want to tell her that I wasn't really interested in history. It was just that the best gory pictures in the world came from the Civil War, and this book was full of them. It really was a great book. There's another thing that's strange about the library. It seems like time flies when you're in one. One second, I was opening the first page of the book, hearing the cracking sound the page makes, smelling all the page powder, and reading what battle the picture on what that page was from. And the next second, the librarian was standing over me saying, "I'm very impressed. You really devoured that book, didn't you? But it's time to close now. You may start up again first thing tomorrow." I couldn't believe it. It had happened again. I'd spent the whole day reading. Her words snapped a spell that was on me, and my stomach started growling right away. I was going to be too late for the mission. When she was walking me to the door, the librarian stopped at her desk and said, "Now I know that knowledge is a food, but I couldn't help noticing you never went to eat. You must be very hungry." She handed me a paper bag and gave me another smile. "Thank you, ma'am." She smiled. "See you tomorrow." I said, "Yes, ma'am. Thank you for everything." I went back under the Christmas tree and got my suitcase. By this time tomorrow, I'd be looking at the face of the man who had to be my father. I started eating the cheese sandwich the librarian gave me, and then I headed out for Grand Rapids. It's funny how ideas are. In a lot of ways, they're just like seeds. Both of them start real small, and then whoop, zoop, sloop. Before you can say Jack Robinson, they've gone and grown a lot bigger than you ever thought they could. If you look at a great big maple tree, it's hard to believe it started out as a little seed. I mean, if you pick one of those maple tree seeds and turn it over a couple of times in your hand, There's no way your brain will buy that this little thing can grow up into something so big you have to bend your neck back just to see the top of it. Something so big that you can hang a swing on it, or build a treehouse in it, or drive a car into it and kill yourself and any bad luck passengers that might be taking a ride with you. Ideas are a lot like that. That's what the idea of Herman E. Callaway being my father started as. Something so teeny that if I hadn't paid it no mind, it would have blown away with the first good puff of wind. But now, here it was so big and important and spread out. The idea first got started when I was looking in my suitcase at one of the flyers showing Herman E. Callaway and his band. That was like the seed falling out of a tree and getting planted. It started busting its head out of the dirt when me and the other boys at the home were getting our nightly teasings from the biggest bully there, Billy Burns. He said, I don't even belong in this place. I've been put here by mistake, and it ain't going to be long before my mama comes and gets me out. Bugs said, Billy, how come it's taking your mama so long to find out where you're at? She must have a real bad memory. Seems like since she was the one what dropped you off here, she'd have remembered where she left you by now. Billy said, well, will you take a look at who piped up? Mr. Bugs. You know, I've seen lots of people who have roach-infested houses, but you're the first person I've seen who's got a roach-infected head. I wouldn't expect a little ignorant roach head like you to know nothing about folks coming back here to get you out. You don't even have no idea who your mama and daddy is. Any fool you see walking down the street could be them. He looked at the rest of us and said, 7 little boys in this room, and not one of y'all knows who your folks is. This is a sure enough sad collection of souls here, boy. I said, that's not true. I know who my mama is. I lived with her for 6 years. Another boy said, me too. I lived with my mama for a long time. Billy Burns said to me, is that right? And what about your old man? How many years you lived with him? I got a nickel here, and you know what it says. Billy stole a nickel from somewhere and held it up so the buffalo on it was looking out at us. He pretended the buffalo was talking. It had a deep voice like you'd figure a buffalo would. It said, Billy, my man, go ahead and bet this little no mama fool that he don't know who his daddy is. Then I'd have another nickel to bang around in your pocket with. Even before I had a chance to think, I said, you owe me a nickel. My daddy plays a giant fiddle, and his name is Herman E. Callaway. And with those words that I didn't even mean to say, that little seed of an idea started growing. The idea got bigger and stronger when I'd sit up at night and wonder why Mom had kept those fires. It dug its roots in deep and started spreading out when I got old enough to understand that Mama must have known she wasn't going to be around too long and was trying to leave me a message about who my daddy was and why she couldn't never talk about him. I knew Mama must be too embarrassed about why he wasn't with us and was trying to break it to me gentle. The only trouble was she waited too long. I mean, what other reason could there be for Mama to keep all these things I have in my suitcase and treat them like they were treasures? And why did I know way down in my guts that they were real important, so important that I didn't feel comfortable unless I knew where they were all the time? That little idea had gone and sneaked itself into being a mighty maple tall enough that if I looked up at the top of it, I'd get a crick in my neck, big enough for me to hang a climbing rope in, strong enough that I made up my mind to walk clean across the state of Michigan. I opened my suitcase and pulled the flyers out before it got dark. I put the blue one with the writing about Flint on it on the bottom and looked at the others. The 2 of them had the same picture of Herman E. Callaway on the two guys, but the first was called Herman E. Callaway and the Terminally Unhappy Blues Band. They were called Masters of the Delta Blues. And the other one was called Herman E. Callaway and the Gifted Gents of Gospel, featuring Miss Grace, Blessed Thomas's vocals. They were the servants of the Master's salvation. The 2 other flyers just had little drawings. The first one was a drawing of an accordion and told about a band named H.E. Kowalski and the Wonderful Warblers of Warsaw, who were the masters of the polka. The second one was of a picture of some mountains, and it told about a band named H.E. Bongut and the Boisterous Big Band of Berlin, who were the masters of all we behold. I put the flyers back in the suitcase and stood up. Just like Bugs, I was going west.